America's backcountry highways were built for movement, for the extraction of timber and ore and agricultural goods from the interior, for the connection of isolated communities to larger markets, for the passage of commerce and people across distances that the landscape would otherwise make impassable. They were not built with any consideration of what already occupied the territory they crossed. The road engineers who surveyed the routes and the construction crews who laid the asphalt were solving logistical problems, not making philosophical inquiries into what had lived in those places before the pavement arrived. But the highways crossed land that carried its own history, its own understanding of what moved through it, and in certain corridors across the American Southwest, the Upper Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and the river valleys of Appalachia, the people who used those roads after dark began to report things that the engineers had not accounted for. The accounts came from different decades, different geographies, different kinds of witnesses with no connection to one another. They described different creatures, arrived at through different cultural frameworks, and were assessed by very different institutions. What they shared was the road itself, a strip of asphalt laid across land that had been occupied long before the road came, and that appeared, in the testimony of those who traveled it after dark, to still be occupied by something the road had not displaced. The Devil's Highway Route 666 and the creature reports of the Four Corners region, 1926 to 2003. The number came about through bureaucratic accident. In 1925, federal highway planners were organizing a national route system across the American Southwest, adding branches and extensions to the existing numbered corridors. The sixth spur added to historic Route 66 was designated, logically enough, Route 660. A technicality at a subsequent planning meeting forced another adjustment. By 1926, that spur carried the number 666. The planners who assigned it had no particular interest in the number's biblical associations, and the road itself had no special character at that moment to warrant concern. It was simply a north-south corridor linking Gallup, New Mexico, through the high desert of the Colorado Plateau, past the Navajo Nation, through the southwestern corner of Colorado, and north into Monticello, Utah. 200 miles of two-lane asphalt crossing some of the most remote terrain in the continental United States at elevations ranging from 2,900 feet near Gallup to over 11,000 feet in the Colorado highlands. No one expected the number to matter. Within a generation, everyone along the road would agree that it did. The highway passed through geography that the Navajo people had occupied and understood for centuries before the first paved mile was laid. Shiprock, which rises 1,583 feet from the surrounding desert plain in northwestern New Mexico and sits within direct sight of the road's New Mexico segment, is among the most sacred formations in Navajo cosmology. The Navajo name for it translates roughly as rock with wings, and the formation figures in creation stories that predate European contact by hundreds of years. Access to Shiprock's summit has long been prohibited out of respect for the spirits believed to inhabit it. The broader region between Gallup and the Colorado border, much of which falls within the Navajo Nation, carries its own extensive traditions regarding creatures and presences that are not human. Among them is the figure the Navajo call Yi-Naldlushi, which translates in the Navajo language as by means of it. It goes on all fours. This is the entity that outsiders would come to call the skinwalker. Traditional Navajo belief holds that it represents a category of witch who has participated in forbidden ceremonies, committed an act of extreme taboo, and acquired through that corruption the ability to assume animal forms. The subject is not discussed openly in Navajo communities, particularly not with outsiders, and scholars studying Navajo culture have noted consistently that the reluctance to speak of it is not superstition, but a principled silence maintained to protect the integrity of the tradition. Cherokee Nation academic Adrian Keene, founder of the website Native Appropriations, has written that incorporating these legends into non-Navajo media exposes Native communities to a barrage of questions about beliefs that were never meant to be shared publicly. Despite that silence, reports of anomalous creatures along the road began accumulating from the moment the highway was open to regular traffic. The accounts followed a pattern that would become familiar over decades. A driver traveling the New Mexico segment north of Gallup after dark reported seeing an animal cross the road at high speed, moving in a way that struck the witness as wrong, the gait too fluid, the size inconsistent with any local wildlife, the eyes catching the headlights in a color and intensity that seemed unnatural. A second category of report involved figures at the roadside that appeared human and then did not. A third category, more difficult to explain even in practical terms, described the experience of something entering a stopped or slow-moving vehicle without any door or window opening. None of these accounts were collected in a systematic way, and no law enforcement agency assigned any investigative resources to them. They passed instead through the informal networks of Navajo families, long-haul truckers, and traveling salespeople who used the route regularly and shared stories at fuel stops and roadside diners. The portion of Route 666 running north of Gallup through the Navajo Nation was not only the stretch most associated with these accounts, it was also the stretch that developed a documented and measurable record of fatal accidents. Between 1,985 and 1,992, 22 people were killed on Route 666. In 2001, 15 people died in traffic accidents on the highway. In 2002, 11 more died. By 1997, the road had been officially classified as one of the 20 most hazardous roads in the United States. Transportation analysts examining the fatality data would later note that the numbers were not evenly distributed along the full 200 miles. The Colorado and Utah portions of the road had accident rates near or below the national average. The deaths were concentrated in a specific segment of the New Mexico section, a stretch north of Gallup that combined inadequate road design, the specific traffic volumes of that era, and driving conditions that were genuinely hazardous at night. But that analytical conclusion came later. At the time, for the communities living along the road, the numbers were simply accumulating. In 1990, USA Today reported a quotation from a state trooper who had worked the Route 666 corridor and was recalling the highway's record. The trooper's words were direct: "666 is evil. Everyone dies on that highway." The quote was widely circulated. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece on the road's reputation under the headline, "Beast of a Highway, Does Asphalt Stretch Have Biblical Curse?" In 1998, The New Yorker published a cartoon set on the highway. Route 666 had become, without any deliberate promotion, one of the most recognized road designations in the country. The recognition was not the kind that attracted tourism. The 666 signs along the highway were stolen so frequently and in such volume that maintaining them became an ongoing expense for state transportation departments. The signs did not disappear into private collections for long. They turned up almost immediately on auction platforms, where buyers paid substantial premiums for them. The creature accounts from this era were not limited to the Skinwalker figure. Truckers reported encountering an 18-wheel semi on the open road late at night that appeared engulfed in flames and bore down on them from the opposite lane before vanishing as the vehicles closed the distance. The flaming truck account was sufficiently consistent across multiple reports, from witnesses who had no obvious connection to one another, that it became a recognized feature of Route 666 folklore in its own right. A separate category of report described packs of dogs encountered along the remote sections of road, animals that witnesses said moved at speeds inconsistent with any domestic breed, that maintained pace alongside accelerating vehicles, and whose eyes reflected headlights with an intensity and color that multiple witnesses described as yellow. Researchers who gathered these accounts in the 1990s and early 2000s noted that the Hellhound reports came from both Navajo and non-Navajo sources, and that the descriptions, gathered independently, were broadly consistent in their specifics. The most widely reported figure was not an animal at all, however. It was a young woman in a white dress who appeared without warning at the roadside, in sections of the highway where no structures stood within miles. Witnesses who stopped to offer assistance reported that the woman vanished before they could reach her. Several witnesses reported encountering the same figure twice during a single drive, at points miles apart, which was not logistically possible if the figure had remained in place. What made the Route 666 accounts structurally interesting, from a documentary standpoint, was the degree to which the creature reports and the accident record became entangled in the public conversation about the road. Transportation officials trying to address the legitimate safety problems of the New Mexico segment found themselves working in an environment where the roadway had already been assigned a supernatural explanation by a significant portion of the driving public. Some residents along the route had begun refusing to use the highway at night, regardless of necessity. The Navajo Nation, whose lands the road bisected, had its own relationship with the reports that was separate from both the safety statistics and the popular folklore circulating among non-native drivers. For Navajo communities, the creatures associated with the road were not a curiosity or a tourist attraction. They were a continuation of traditions that had always understood that particular landscape as one requiring careful attention and respect. By the late 1990s, the governors of New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah had begun actively campaigning to rename the highway. The effort was not framed primarily around the creature reports. The public argument centered on the economic impact of the road's reputation, on the ongoing cost of replacing stolen signs, and on the perception that the 666 designation was discouraging development in communities along the corridor. A formal resolution passed in New Mexico's legislature acknowledged that there were people who refused to travel the road not because of safety concerns, but because they believed the number itself brought harm. Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico led the final effort. In May 2003, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials approved the change. Route 666 became U.S. Route 491. The new number derived from its position as the fourth route off US 191. The 666 signs along the highway were removed within weeks. They were replaced on auction sites within days. The renaming had a measurable effect on accident rates. Transportation analysts noted a significant decline in fatalities on the New Mexico segment in the years following the 2003 change. The decline tracked closely with road improvements that had been made to that same segment. Improvements that addressed the engineering deficiencies that analysts had identified as the primary driver of the accident concentration north of Gallup. Whether the renaming itself changed driver behavior in ways that contributed to the safety improvement is a question that was never formally studied. The creature reports largely ceased to appear in any organized documentation after 2003. The road had a new number, and the cultural infrastructure that had accumulated around the old one, the stolen signs, the trucker stories, the roadside accounts shared at fuel stops and diners, no longer had the same organizing identity to attach to. U.S. Route 491 runs today through the same landscape, past the same desert formations, alongside the same sections of Navajo Nation land, between the same scattered communities that had nothing to do with the number the road once carried, and had no particular interest in its reputation. The creatures that were reported along it were never formally investigated, and were never explained. They exist now as a record of what people said they saw, on a road that no longer bears the name they set it under. The Beast of Bray Road documented encounters on County Road B, Elkhorn, Wisconsin, 1,936 to present. Bray Road does not appear on most maps of Wisconsin under that name. It is designated County Road B in Walworth County, a rural two-lane connector that runs east of the city of Elkhorn between Highway 12 and Highway 11, passing through farmland, drainage fields, and stands of hardwood that separate one agricultural parcel from the next. The road was named for a farming family that settled the land in the previous century, and for most of its existence, it was the kind of road that exists in every agricultural county in the upper Midwest. Functional, unremarkable, traveled primarily by the families who lived on it. Elkhorn itself is the seat of Walworth County, population around 10,000, located in the corner of Wisconsin that borders Illinois, and sits within easy driving distance of Milwaukee and Chicago. It is not an isolated place. The road it gave its name to, or rather the road that gave its name to what began happening on it, is in some ways more remote than its geography suggests, because what was reported there, starting in the late 1980s, established County Road B as one of the most consistently documented sites of anomalous creature sightings in the modern American record. The first reported encounter connected to the broader legend occurred in 1936, which predates the events that would eventually bring national attention to the area by more than 50 years. Mark Shackleman was a night watchman employed at St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children, a Franciscan institution located on a rural property outside Jefferson, Wisconsin, approximately 15 miles northwest of Elkhorn. On 2 consecutive nights in 1936, Shackleman encountered something on the school grounds while making his rounds near midnight. The property contained a number of old structures, an orchard, open fields, and several preserved Native American burial mounds. On the first night, Shackleman saw a large figure digging at one of the mounds. He described it as standing upright, covered in hair, with an animal-like face. On the second night, the figure was in the same area, and Shackleman, who was not reported as a person given to dramatic statements, described hearing it make a sound that he characterized as a 3-syllable utterance. He did not report the encounter publicly. It entered the record only later, through interviews conducted decades afterward, when researchers were assembling the history of what witnesses in the region had described over time. By the 1980s, reports from the Elkhorn area had begun accumulating quietly through channels that were not official. Farmers who worked properties bordering Bray Road and the adjacent fields mentioned encounters to neighbors and family members that they did not report to any authority, having no particular expectation that an authority existed to receive such a report. The The descriptions were consistent enough in their general features to suggest that different people were describing encounters with the same or similar thing. The creature they described was large, covered in brown or grayish fur, capable of moving on all fours but also observed standing and moving on two legs, with a long snout and eyes that caught artificial light in an unusual way. Several accounts from this period described the creature in proximity to dead animals, crouched at the roadside or in the adjacent drainage ditches, apparently feeding. These accounts did not coalesce into a documented record until the witnesses began to find one another, which happened only after a reporter at a small weekly newspaper decided to investigate. The anchor account, the one that gave the legend its geographic name and that was delivered with a specificity unusual in reports of this kind, came on the 31st of October, 1989. Lori Endrizzi was the manager of a lounge in Elkhorn called the Jury Room. At approximately 1:30 inches the morning, after her shift, she was driving along Bray Road when her headlights illuminated a form at the roadside that she initially took for a person. As she drew closer, she understood that it was not. The figure was crouched over what appeared to be a small carcass, holding it in what Endrizzi described as clawed hands, with the palms facing upward, in a posture she would later say was specifically what distinguished the encounter from any animal sighting she had experienced before. A person holds things that way. The figure straightened as her headlights hit it fully, standing she estimated at 6 feet, covered in shaggy gray fur, with a face she described as elongated and canine, and eyes that reflected her headlights in yellow. She reduced her speed for a clearer look and then accelerated when the creature turned and looked directly at her. She did not report it that night. She was a grown woman in her 30s, employed and stable, and she had no expectation of being believed. She told people she trusted, in the way that people tell accounts they are not prepared to defend publicly, and the account entered the informal network of Elkhorn residents who had their own versions of similar stories. 2 years later, on the 31st of October 1991, an encounter took place on the same road that moved the accounts from the informal record into something approaching official attention. Doristine Gibson was driving along Bray Road near the Delavan area when she felt her right front tire rise, as if she had struck something in the road. She stopped and got out to look. When she looked toward the roadside, she saw a large figure running toward her from the ditch line. She made it back to her car, but the creature reached the vehicle before she could accelerate away. She later reported that it lifted the rear of her car. The physical description she gave matched what Endrizzi had reported 2 years earlier in its specifics: the fur, the height, the bipedal movement, the general form of the face. Gibson did not have a prior relationship with Endrizzi's account. She was a young woman driving home from an ordinary evening, and the encounter left scratch marks on the rear of her vehicle that she showed to family members. The Walworth County Sheriff's Office was not called that night, but the account found its way through the local community with the kind of speed that characterizes genuine disruption rather than constructed narrative. It was these accumulating reports that the Walworth County Week, a local weekly newspaper based in Elkhorn, decided to investigate. The assignment went to Linda Godfrey, a reporter who had been with the paper and who approached the story with what she later described as thorough skepticism. She expected to find the kind of story that investigates itself out of existence, on contact with the actual witnesses, contradictory, vague, attached to people whose other statements were unreliable. What she found instead was a body of accounts from people she described in her notes as having no apparent motive to fabricate, who gave consistent details they had not shared with one another, and who in many cases were visibly reluctant to be on record. She conducted door-to-door interviews across the area, ultimately mapping more than 40 accounts that she found credible enough to document. On the 29th of December 1991, Godfrey published her first article on the subject in the Week. The town of Elkhorn received it in the complicated way that small communities receive confirmation of something they were already half aware of. Local businesses created merchandise. A tavern offered drinks called Silver Bullet Specials, and simultaneously, people who had not come forward before began contacting Godfrey to add their own accounts to the record. Among those who came forward in the months following Godfrey's first article was a dairy farmer who described seeing the creature on his property in 1989, the same year as Endrizzi's account. He had not reported it because, as he told Godfrey, he did not see how reporting it would improve his situation. A girl named Heather Bowie, 11 years old at the time of the encounter in early 1992, told Godfrey that she and friends had seen a large animal near a creek in Elkhorn that approached them upright before they ran. Her description of the face matched the adult accounts in its specifics, though she had no access to those accounts at the time of her experience. A woman who lived along a property adjoining the road described footprints in her yard that measured over 12 inches in length and said she found one of her horses injured, with a gash across its back, on a morning following a night during which she had heard sounds she could not identify. None of these accounts produced physical evidence that was preserved in a form usable for systematic analysis. Godfrey was aware of this deficit and documented it honestly, writing in her research that there was a high probability that not all witnesses were seeing the same thing, and that some sightings might represent misidentification or even fabrication, while others represented something she could not account for through conventional means. Godfrey eventually turned her investigation into a book, published in 2003 by Prairie Oak Press under the title The Beast of Bray Road, Tailing Wisconsin's Werewolf. The book compiled witness accounts gathered over more than a decade of interviewing, organized chronologically, and accompanied by Godfrey's own analysis of what the various accounts shared and where they diverged. Among the witnesses she described as particularly credible was a former assistant district attorney who had seen the creature while driving near the road. Godfrey was careful in her language. She did not argue for any single explanation. She documented what people said and noted where the accounts converged. Cryptozoologist Loren Coleman conducted his own investigation of the Elkhorn area during the 1990s, surveying the locations most frequently mentioned in witness accounts and collecting soil samples near areas where large tracks had been reported. His findings confirmed the presence of a large animal in the area, but did not resolve the question of what it was. A 2009 episode of the cable program Monster Quest deployed thermal imaging cameras along Bray Road through the night and recorded heat signatures in the adjacent woods that investigators identified as deer. The descriptions given by witnesses across more than 3 decades showed a consistency that was difficult to account for solely through cultural transmission. The height range given by most witnesses fell between 5 and 7 feet when the creature was standing. The fur was described across accounts as brownish or grayish and shaggy. The face was consistently described as elongated and canine, with prominent eyes that reflected artificial light intensely. The hands, when visible, were described in ways that distinguished them from paws, with an articulation that witnesses compared to human hands, despite the presence of claws. Several witnesses, asked independently what most disturbed them about the encounter, gave versions of the same answer. The creature looked at them in a way that registered as deliberate attention rather than animal alarm. That quality, the sense of being recognized rather than merely detected, was the element of the accounts that proved most resistant to the explanations that investigators and skeptics applied to the physical descriptions. Wolves had been sighted in Walworth County. Black bears with mange could, under certain conditions, move in ways that resembled bipedal locomotion. These explanations addressed the form of the accounts without addressing the witnesses' understanding of what made them significant. Linda Godfrey continued to receive and document creature reports from Elkhorn and from a widening geography across the upper Midwest for the rest of her career. The sightings along Bray Road became less frequent after the concentrated period of the late 1980s and early 1990s, though they did not stop entirely, and isolated accounts continued to reach Godfrey through the 2000s and 2010s. In 2018, the production company Small Town Monsters released a documentary titled The Bray Road Beast, directed by Seth Breedlove, which revisited several of the original witnesses on camera and gathered new testimony from people who had not previously spoken publicly. Godfrey, who appeared in the documentary and had been the primary researcher on the subject since 1991, died in early 2025 after a long illness. She had spent more than 30 years as the person most willing to sit with witnesses and take seriously what they reported. What runs along County Road B east of Elkhorn, whether it is a known animal behaving in unknown ways, something not yet categorized, or some quality of human perception that generates consistent error under specific conditions, was not resolved in her lifetime. It has not been resolved since. The road through the checkerboard creature reports along U.S. Highway 550, northwestern New Mexico, 1,957, to present. U.S. Highway 550 does not appear on most paranormal maps of the American Southwest. It lacks the name recognition of Route 666, which ran through the same general region before its 2003 renaming, and it has never attracted the sustained media attention given to the ranch properties in Utah that have become shorthand for the region's anomalous reputation. It is simply a 4-lane divided highway running northwest through the San Juan Basin of New Mexico, connecting Albuquerque to Bloomfield and Farmington, passing through the high desert communities of Cuba, Regina, Counselor, and Nageezi along the way. The section between Cuba and Bloomfield crosses what is known as the checkerboard, a patchwork of reservation land, allotted parcels, Bureau of Land Management holdings, and oil and gas leases that creates a landscape with no clean boundaries between Navajo Nation territory and non-tribal land. New Mexico Highway 44, the predecessor designation, was paved through this corridor in the 1950s. For the Navajo families who have lived along it for generations, the highway is infrastructure, not legend. What passes through the landscape on either side of it is a separate question, and one that Navajo communities have answered for themselves in terms that outsiders have often misunderstood. The entity that has been most consistently reported in this region is called Yi-Nald-Lushi in the Navajo language. The phrase translates as, "By means of it, it goes on all fours." It is one of several categories of which recognized in traditional Navajo belief, specifically, a kind of practitioner who is understood to have undergone a ceremony of profound moral corruption, committed the most extreme taboo available within Navajo cultural law, and in doing so acquired the ability to assume animal forms. The tradition holds that this individual can move with unnatural speed, can mimic human voices, and can approach the homes of families at night without being seen until it chooses to be. It is not a creature in the way the term is used in cryptozoology or popular entertainment. It is a person who has chosen to become something other than a person. Traditional Navajo people do not discuss this subject openly with outsiders, and scholars studying Navajo culture have consistently noted that this silence is not evasion, but a principled cultural boundary. To speak of the Yi-Nald-Lushi carelessly is understood to invite its attention. The sightings that have been reported along the Highway 550 corridor are reports not of a cryptid in the Pacific Northwest tradition, but of encounters with something that the people who live nearest to it have their own complete framework for understanding. The highway passes close to a number of sites that carry specific significance in Navajo cosmology. Huerfano Mountain, visible from several points along the corridor near the community of Nageezi, is one of the sacred mountains of the Navajo people and figures centrally in the Blessing Way ceremony, which is among the most important healing and protective ceremonies in Navajo practice. The ruins along the Chaco Wash, accessible from the highway via unpaved county roads south of Nageezi, were the center of a major ancestral Puebloan civilization that predated Navajo presence in the region by centuries, and which the Navajo came to understand as carrying its own complex spiritual character. The checkerboard land pattern along the highway corridor is not only a legal and jurisdictional phenomenon, it is a geography in which very old presences and very old obligations have been woven together across a long time, and the highway itself, paved in the 1950s across territory that had been in continuous use by Navajo families for generations, runs through rather than around this accumulated weight. Reports of anomalous encounters along and adjacent to Highway 550 are not systematically collected in any public database. They exist primarily within Navajo communities, where they circulate through the networks of family and neighborhood that have always been the medium through which such accounts are shared and assessed. A person who saw something near the road at night did not call a paranormal hotline. They told the people they trusted, who knew the land, and who could assess the account in terms of what was already known about what moved through that area after dark. The accounts that escaped this internal circulation and entered any record that could be externally examined tended to do so because something official happened, either because a formal complaint was filed, or because the encounter was severe enough that it could not be contained within informal channels. That is the condition that brought the cases in this region to the attention of the only law enforcement unit in the United States formally tasked with investigating them. The Navajo Rangers were established in 1957 by Richard Fowler Van Valkenburg, a non-native scholar who had dedicated his career to working with and for the Navajo Nation. They are a federal law enforcement agency, trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Artesia, New Mexico, recognized by the federal government as federal officers, and operationally separate from the Navajo Police, which handles public safety in Navajo communities. The Rangers' responsibilities cover the 27,000 square miles of the reservation across northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, and southeastern Utah. Their mandate covers cultural resources, forestry, parks, fish and game, backcountry patrol, search and rescue, and a range of other land management and public safety functions. In 2000, the Navajo Rangers' Chief Ranger called a meeting and informed the assembled officers that the department would begin formally investigating a category of case it had previously left unaddressed. A complaint had been filed alleging that a Bigfoot report had not been investigated. The Chief Ranger identified Stanley Milford Jr. and Jonathan Redbird Dover as the officers who would handle what he called the major cases in this new category. Stanley Milford Jr. had grown up between rural Oklahoma and the Navajo Reservation, attended Haskell Indian Junior College in Kansas and the University of Arizona, and graduated from the United States Indian Police Academy at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center before joining the Rangers. Jonathan Redbird Dover was a veteran officer who would retire in 2011 after 31 years in law enforcement, having served with the City of Winslow, Arizona Police Department, the National Park Service, and the Navajo Historic Preservation Department before the Rangers. Dover had been trained as a specialist in archaeological resource crimes investigations, as a licensed EMT, in SWAT tactical operations and hazardous materials response, in technical accident investigation and computer forensics. Both men had grown up with partial Navajo heritage, but, as the Chief Ranger noted, without the deep immersion in traditional belief that would make the assignment culturally paralyzing. They were chosen because they could approach the cases with forensic discipline while remaining respectful of the traditions that shaped the communities reporting them. Their unit was called the Special Projects Unit. The paranormal cases they were assigned represented, by their own later accounting, less than 1% of everything they handled. They nevertheless became the defining feature of their careers. Over the 11 years they conducted paranormal investigations, Milford and Dover documented cases involving Bigfoot sightings, UFO encounters, hauntings, and reports of Navajo witchcraft and skinwalker activity across the reservation. The cases came from the full geographic range of Navajo territory, from Arizona to Utah, and the New Mexico corridor served by Highway 550 produced a consistent share of them. Their methodology was deliberate. They measured footprints, reviewed surveillance footage, collected physical samples, and interviewed witnesses using the same structured approach they applied to conventional investigations. They found evidence they could not explain. In a region near the highway's passage through the checkerboard, a trail camera installed near a property that had reported ongoing disturbances captured the silhouette of a large bipedal creature on 2 frames taken within 1 minute of each other. The frames were reviewed by Milford and Dover without a conclusion that resolved what had been recorded. Footprint casts, taken from several locations in the region, measured dimensions inconsistent with any known animal. Audio recordings captured near the San Juan Basin communities documented sounds that witnesses identified as related to the encounters they had reported and that Milford was unable to assign to any identifiable source. The cultural complexity surrounding these investigations was substantial. Within traditional Navajo belief, investigating a skinwalker is not a neutral act. To look for it is to place oneself in a relationship with it, and traditional Navajo people have protocols for managing that relationship that are not part of standard law enforcement procedure. Milford, who later described his own background as situated between the traditional and the modern, documented the effect the investigations had on witnesses and on himself. A clinical psychiatrist from the western region of the Navajo Reservation, who asked not to be identified, told one researcher studying the region that within 3 to 4 sessions with Navajo clients, 50% would identify their presenting problems as connected to a skinwalker encounter. Whether that connection was understood as literal or metaphorical was, from a clinical standpoint, less important than the reality of the harm the belief in the encounter was causing. The psychiatrist was not in the business of evaluating whether the encounters were real. She was in the business of treating the people who had lived through them. The distinction was not one she found useful to insist on. In 2014, a photograph circulated rapidly through social media that claimed to show a figure on the roadside near Liebrook and Counselor, communities that sit directly on Highway 550 inches, the checkerboard section. The image was accompanied by a story about a geologist working in the oil fields of the area who had taken a heat signature photograph of an anomalous presence and quit his job the following day. The image was debunked within hours by local television station KRQE in Albuquerque, which traced it to a 1980s science fiction film. The incident was notable less for the image itself than for the speed of its spread and the nature of the response. The debunking did not slow the circulation of the original story. People who shared and commented on the image described feeling afraid to drive through the Counselor corridor that night. Several said they had personal accounts they had not previously shared that the image had prompted them to bring forward. The KRQE report noted that the legend's reach was demonstrated precisely by how quickly a demonstrably false photograph had activated it. Stanley Milford Jr. retired from the Navajo Rangers after more than 23 years of service, eventually serving as the delegated Chief Navajo Ranger before leaving in March 2019. He subsequently worked as the senior investigator for the Navajo Nation's White-Collar Crime Unit. In 2024, William Morrow published his memoir of the paranormal investigations, titled The Paranormal Ranger, A Navajo Investigator's Search for the Unexplained. The book covers the cases from across the reservation in the terms in which Milford understood them, as a law enforcement officer who had been assigned something that did not fit into law enforcement's normal categories and who had done his job anyway. The section of Highway 550 between Cuba and Bloomfield still runs through the checkerboard today. It is a 4-lane divided highway with a speed limit of 70 miles per hour through the open stretches. Gas stations are separated by long distances, and the landscape on both sides of the road is the kind of terrain that does not give back what it takes. The Navajo families who live along it know what moves through it at night. Most of them have decided that knowing is sufficient and that looking is something else entirely. Crossing the Cascades documented Bigfoot reports along Oregon Highway 20 and the Central Cascade Corridor, 1,970 to present. Oregon Highway 20 runs for approximately 430 miles across the width of the state, beginning at the Pacific coast at Newport and ending in the high desert near the Idaho border at Nyssa. The section that concerns this chapter is the stretch through the Cascade Mountain Range in central Oregon, where the highway climbs from the Willamette Valley at Albany, passes through the old logging communities of Sweet Home and Mill City, skirts the southern edge of Detroit Lake in the western Cascades, rises over Santiam Pass at an elevation of 4,817 feet, and descends through the pine forests of the eastern slope into Bend and the beginning of the high desert plateau. This crossing of the Cascades is approximately 130 miles of 2-lane mountain highway with minimal services, long stretches between communities, and on either side of the pavement, a contiguous forest system that extends for hundreds of thousands of acres without interruption. The Cascades of Oregon are among the least traversed ranges in the American West. They are not the Alps or the Rockies, not a destination in themselves for most travelers, but a barrier to be crossed. And Highway 20 is one of the relatively few places where a car can cross them without elaborate planning or seasonal restrictions. The creature reported along this corridor and throughout the Pacific Northwest is known as Sasquatch, a word derived from the Halkomelem language of the Coast Salish peoples of British Columbia, where the term referred to wild men or monsters understood to inhabit the forests. The version of this figure that entered the general American consciousness did so through the media coverage of 1958, when a bulldozer operator named Jerry Crew found a series of large humanoid footprints at a construction site near Bluff Creek in Humboldt County, California, and brought plaster casts to the local newspaper. The Humboldt Times published the story, introduced the term Bigfoot as a headline convenience, and the name entered common use with a speed that reflected how many people in the Pacific Northwest already had their own accounts they had been keeping to themselves, what those people had been observing since long before 1958, and what Pacific Northwest indigenous nations had been articulating in their own traditions for centuries, suddenly had a name that the broader American public recognized. Oregon accumulated more documented Bigfoot reports than almost any other state. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, founded in 1995 and operating as an all-volunteer network of researchers and investigators who vet reports before publishing them, maintained a database that by the 2020s had grown to more than 250 credible investigated listings from across Oregon. Clackamas County led all Oregon counties with 29 documented reports, concentrated along Route 224 near the town of Estacada, a stretch of road that researchers and local residents came to call the Oregon Bigfoot Highway. Deschutes County, which lies east of the Cascades and is accessible from the western slope via Highway 20, accumulated 52 entries in the OregonBigfoot.com database, making it one of the most reported counties in the state. The high concentration of reports on both the western and eastern approaches to the Cascades along the Highway 20 corridor was not coincidental. The Cascades form a continuous north-south wildlife corridor with almost no development in their interior, and Highway 20's crossing through Santiam Pass represents one of the few points where a vehicle-accessible road passes through the middle of it. The earliest documented encounter associated specifically with the Highway 20 corridor that entered the formal record came from the Detroit Lake area in 1970. Detroit Lake is a reservoir in Marion County created by the damming of the North Santiam River, situated along the highway approximately 40 miles east of Albany. A man had brought his young daughter Chloe to his logging camp on the lake's eastern side. During the night, the girl woke to sounds she did not recognize and opened the inner door of her sleeping area to the camp's front porch. At the far end of the porch, she saw a large figure standing at an open cooler that held camp food supplies, a 20-pound piece of meat clamped under its arm. The figure was large enough and sufficiently different in its proportions from any animal the girl was familiar with that she was unable to make sense of it in the moment. The men in the camp woke to the disturbance and pursued the figure with flashlights. They found footprints in the ground measuring approximately 14 inches. The father, who was interviewed years later by researchers who documented the account, noted that a bear had previously gotten into the same cooler and had left its contents in disorder. Whatever had been at the cooler the night his daughter saw it had handled the food selectively and left the remaining items in organized condition. The father also reported that several weeks earlier, while driving along the highway at dusk, he had seen a large figure cross the road in his headlights that had frightened him significantly. In the summer of 1999, two witnesses named Dana and Charmaine were fishing from a dock at the Hoover campground on the south side of Detroit Lake, approximately 150 meters from where the Santiam River empties into the reservoir. At evening, they heard what the investigator who later documented their account described as a powerful roaring scream emanating from a point along the lake to the west of their position. The sound was sufficiently unusual in its character, its volume, and the absence of any visual source they could identify that both witnesses reported it to researchers. An investigator who responded and collected the account found the Hoover campground site consistent with the history of the broader Detroit Lake and Highway 20 corridor as a location with a pattern of reported events. A fecal specimen collected near the location during the investigation was stored and submitted for scientific analysis. The investigators' notes described the specimen as in excellent condition with abundant parasitic activity. It was examined for content indicating diet and for potential host cells that could provide genetic material. The results of that analysis were not publicly disclosed in terms that resolved what had produced the specimen. In 1989, a driver, returning from Central Oregon to the Willamette Valley over Santiam Pass on Highway 20, reported a crossing event of the kind that appears most frequently in documented road-related accounts from the Cascade Corridor. The witness was traveling at night in light drizzle on the west slope of the pass on the Sweet Home side. The creature walked out of the tree line on the left side of the highway and crossed in front of the vehicle, entering the tree line on the right. The witness had clear headlight visibility of the figure during the crossing. The account was documented by researchers who assessed the witness as credible. The specifics given: a large bipedal figure moving in a purposeful straight line across the highway, neither accelerating nor reacting to the vehicle lights in the way a bear or deer would, was consistent across multiple Highway 20 accounts gathered from different witnesses over different years. The Santiam Pass crossing is a natural funnel point for any large animal moving between the western and eastern slopes of the Cascades, and the frequency of reported crossings at this section of the highway is consistent with that geography, regardless of what one concludes about what was doing the crossing. The OregonBigfoot.com database, which maintained records separate from the BFRO and with an emphasis on the Pacific Northwest, accumulated entries from Deschutes County, east of Santiam Pass, that showed a related pattern. A witness near Bend on the Sun River side described a large, light, reddish-brown, hairy figure standing in the roadway and shielding its eyes from vehicle headlights, a specific behavioral detail that appeared in multiple independent accounts from other states and other years, without any evident mechanism of cultural transmission between the witnesses. The retired director of the Mount Bachelor Ski Resort, identified in the database records as J. Morgan, reported finding large footprints in snow at the mountain, the prints measuring approximately the dimensions given in the majority of track evidence collected across the state. Witnesses in the Three Sisters Wilderness area, accessible from Bend via secondary roads off Highway 20, reported sounds consistent with the vocalization patterns described in accounts from across the Cascade Corridor. Heavy objects crashing through undergrowth, limbs breaking in a sequence suggesting a large animal moving at speed, followed by periods of silence that arrived too quickly for any animal of the size implied by the sounds to have simply moved away. The question of what any given Oregon witness was actually seeing when they reported a large bipedal figure crossing a highway was taken seriously by researchers who did not have a simple answer for it. Peter Byrne, a wildlife researcher who had spent decades investigating Bigfoot reports across the Pacific Northwest and who was sometimes referred to in the research community as one of the four horsemen of Sasquatchery for his early prominence in the field, noted in interviews that the majority of road crossings were reported at night, that the witnesses generally described a figure moving with what they called purpose, and that the consistent specific detail across accounts was that the figure did not react to vehicle lights the way any familiar animal would. Byrne submitted hairs found on a thorn bush in Oregon's Hood River Valley in the late 1970s to the FBI for analysis. The Bureau held the samples for 40 years before returning a finding that they belonged to a deer. The duration of the delay and the nature of what ultimately came back told its own kind of story about how institutions handle material that does not resolve cleanly within their existing categories. Bob Philby, a trained neuroscientist based in the Rogue River area, who spent 30 years mapping Bigfoot sightings along the West Coast, completed an illustrated map of Oregon sightings in 2019 that documented more than 1,000 accounts across the state. He noted in interviews that older reports, from before Bigfoot became a media phenomenon in the late 1950s, accounted for a significant and consistent portion of the record, and that they came from sources with no apparent motive for fabrication and no access to the cultural template that later reports drew on. Miners, frontiersmen, Forest Service employees, engineers, and medical professionals appeared in the historical record with accounts structurally identical to what witnesses were reporting along Highway 20 inches the 1980s and 1990s. Philby, who described himself as a scientist who did not believe in things he had not witnessed himself, said the volume and consistency of the record made it difficult to account for through simple error or fabrication. He was careful not to claim that the accounts proved the existence of an unknown primate. He said instead that humans appeared to need the figure regardless of whether it existed, and that the forest corridors of the Oregon Cascades had been producing testimony about it through 2 centuries and across every demographic category of witness, without interruption. Deschutes County, which Highway 20 enters after crossing Santiam Pass and which reported more entries in the Oregon Bigfoot database than almost any other county in the state, is high desert pine forest on the eastern slope of the Cascades, a geography that is drier and more open than the wet old-growth forest of the western Cascades, but that connects without any formal boundary to the denser country to the west. Highway 20 inches. This section runs through land that was heavily logged in the mid-20th century, and that has been regrowing in the decades since. The regrowth forest is different from what was there before the logging. Younger trees, different density, a changed understory. What moved through the old-growth Cascades before the logging era did so in a forest that no longer exists along this section of the highway. What has been reported along the road since the logging era ended, by witnesses whose accounts share specific descriptive details across decades of independent observation, has been doing so in the second forest, the one that grew back. Whether those are the same thing, whatever the thing is, has not been established. The 13 months, Mothman sightings along the Point Pleasant corridor, West Virginia, November 1966 to December 1967. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sits at the confluence of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers, a small city of fewer than 5,000 people that, for most of the 20th century, was known in the region primarily as an agricultural and commercial center, with a history reaching back to the French and Indian War. State Route 2 runs along the Ohio River through Mason County, connecting Point Pleasant to the surrounding communities of the western West Virginia River corridor. To the north of the city, accessible via Route 62, sits a tract of land locally called the TNT area, a 2,500-acre complex of concrete storage igloos, crumbling concrete bunkers, and overgrown fields that had been an active World War II munitions plant. By 1966, the facility was abandoned, the structures deteriorating, the land transferred to the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, but largely unsupervised. It was in this landscape, at the edge of a former war industry left to decompose into the West Virginia countryside, that the sequence of events reported over the following 13 months began. The first documented sighting in the period that would come to define Point Pleasant's modern identity occurred not in the city itself, but in Clendenin, a small community approximately 50 miles to the east in Kanawha County. On the 12th of November, 1966, 5 men were working in a cemetery on a hill above the Elk River when they looked up and saw something moving rapidly through the trees overhead. They described it as a large, man-like figure in flight, a brown human being, as their account was later summarized, moving from tree to tree at low altitude. None of the 5 men had a framework for what they were describing, and no official investigation followed. The account entered the record only later, as researchers assembled the history of what had been reported in West Virginia during that period. 3 days later, on the night of the 15th of November 1966, the events that would eventually reach a national audience took place on a back road north of Point Pleasant. Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Millette were 2 young married couples from Point Pleasant who were driving together that night near the TNT area. The 4 were in a single vehicle traveling along the road that passed the site of the old munitions plant when they saw, at the side of the road near the North Power Plant building, what Linda Scarberry later described to police as shaped like a man but bigger, possibly 6.5 to 7 feet tall, with large wings folded against its back. She described it as being gray in color. What registered most forcefully on all 4 witnesses were its eyes, which she described as large, red, and glowing. Roger Scarberry accelerated immediately. The creature, by the account all 4 gave separately and consistently, rose and flew after the vehicle. It pursued the car along Route 62 toward Point Pleasant, keeping pace even as Scarberry drove at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. The creature followed them to the city limits before breaking off. The 4 went directly to the Mason County Sheriff's Office and gave their account to the deputy on duty. Roger Scarberry told the local paper the following day that if he had seen it by himself, he would not have said anything. But 4 people saw it, and that made the difference. The Point Pleasant Register published its account of the encounter on the 16th of November, 1966, under the headline, "Couples See Man-Sized Bird, Creature, Something." 2 volunteer firefighters who came forward in the days following the original report said they had seen a large bird with red eyes in the same area. A contractor named Newell Partridge, who lived in the town of Salem, West Virginia, reported that on the same night as the Scarberry-Mallette encounter, he had been watching television when the picture broke into a pattern of strange interference, accompanied by a sound he could not identify coming from outside his house. He aimed a flashlight toward the source of the noise and saw 2 red eyes reflecting the light from a nearby field, which he described as like bicycle reflectors. His dog went toward the source of the sound and never returned. The night after the Scarberry-Mallette encounter, a woman exiting her car in the Point Pleasant area reported that a tall gray figure rose slowly from the ground beside her vehicle and stared at her. She ran inside her home and heard sounds on her porch, then saw 2 red luminous eyes looking in through a window. She was not acquainted with the Scarberry-Mallette account when she reported her own. Mason County Sheriff George Johnson addressed the media reports publicly and suggested that what witnesses were seeing was likely an unusually large heron of a type, locally called a sheetopoke, a term for wading birds generally. Robert L. Smith, a wildlife biologist at West Virginia University, offered a more specific identification: the sandhill crane, a large American crane that stands nearly as tall as a man, has a wingspan of approximately 7 feet, and features reddish coloring around the eyes. Smith noted that the bird might have wandered out of its normal migration corridor in the Mississippi Valley and gone unrecognized by West Virginia residents who would have no basis for identifying it. The sandhill crane explanation was the official position of state and local authorities for the duration of the sighting period. It did not resolve the accounts of witnesses who described bipedal figures with wings folded against their backs, or the pursuit of a vehicle at highway speed, or the ground-level encounters that bore no resemblance to a large wading bird behaving oddly. Reports accumulated through the remaining weeks of November and through 1,967, at a rate that the small media infrastructure of western West Virginia struggled to cover. Mary Heyer, a reporter for the Athens Messenger, the regional newspaper for the Ohio communities across the river from Point Pleasant, filed accounts of the sightings beginning the 16th of November, 1966. Her coverage was consistent and detailed, and she became one of the primary reporters through whom the accounts reached the broader reading public. Paranormal investigator and journalist John Keel, based in New York, traveled to Point Pleasant and conducted interviews over an extended period, ultimately claiming that he had gathered accounts from more than 100 witnesses who reported encounters with the creature or with the strange phenomena that attended the sighting period, including unexplained lights in the sky above the TNT area, interference on televisions and telephones, and visits from individuals whom multiple Point Pleasant residents described as wearing dark suits and asking questions about what people had seen. Jeff Walmsley, a Point Pleasant native who grew up hearing the accounts and who later founded the Mothman Museum in the city's downtown, confirmed in interviews that approximately 100 sightings were documented during the 13 months, with the concentration of activity heaviest around the TNT area and the River Road corridor along Route 2 and Route 62. The 13-month period ended in the community's memory. On the 15th of December 1967, the Silver Bridge was an I-bar chain suspension bridge built in 1928 that carried U.S. Route 35 over the Ohio River, connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio. It had been the first bridge built in the United States using the I-bar chain design rather than conventional wire cable suspension, and for its era, it was considered an engineering achievement. It was named for the aluminum paint used on its ironwork. By 1967, it was carrying traffic far heavier than the loads it had been designed for. The Model T automobiles for which it was built weighed approximately 1,500 pounds. The vehicles crossing it in 1967 averaged 4,000 pounds. At 4:58 inches the afternoon of December 15, during rush hour traffic, the bridge collapsed without warning. 32 vehicles fell into the Ohio River. 46 people were killed. 2 bodies were never recovered. The collapse occurred in less than 60 seconds. Witnesses described hearing a crack like a gunshot before the main span folded into the water. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted the investigation, its first significant highway accident investigation in the agency's history. NTSB investigators, working with experts from the Federal Highway Administration and the states of West Virginia and Ohio, spent 3 years analyzing the wreckage. They determined conclusively that the cause was the fracture of a single eye-bar, designated eye-bar 330, on the north suspension chain on the Ohio side of the bridge. The eye-bar had developed a crack 0.1 inches deep through a process of stress corrosion cracking and corrosion fatigue that had developed over the bridge's 40-year lifespan. The crack was located on the inside surface of the eye-bar's hole, a position inaccessible to visual inspection without disassembly of the joint. There was no structural redundancy in the design. When the eye-bar failed, the load transferred to the adjacent bar, which then failed. The chain separated, and the collapse of the entire structure was, in the NTSB's language, a certainty. The Silver Bridge collapse led directly to the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1968 and the creation of National Bridge Inspection Standards, requiring all public bridges with spans over 20 feet to be inspected every 2 years. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered all bridges in the United States to undergo safety inspections in the immediate aftermath. The NTSB stated directly and on record that no evidence was ever found connecting the Mothman to the failure. The conjunction of the sightings and the bridge collapse was made formally in print by writer Gray Barker in 1970, and then developed at length by John Keel in his 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, which argued that the creature sightings were connected to a broader pattern of paranormal events and that the appearances constituted a warning of the impending disaster. The book was adapted into a 2002 film starring Richard Gere, shot partly in Point Pleasant, which introduced the legend to a national audience that had not been alive during the original events. The Mothman Museum opened in Point Pleasant in 2006, founded by Jeff Wamsley, who assembled an archive that includes the original handwritten witness statements from 1966 and 1967, sketches made by witnesses at the time of their encounters, and documentation from the period that is not available anywhere else. An annual Mothman festival in Point Pleasant has grown to draw more than 15,000 visitors to a city of under 5,000 residents. A 12-foot chrome statue of the creature stands in the city's downtown. What Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mollett saw on Route 62 north of Point Pleasant on the night of November 15, 1966, was never explained to their satisfaction by the Sandhill Crane theory or any other official account. It was 13 months before the Silver Bridge fell. The connection between those two facts is the kind of thing that evidence cannot settle and that a community, once it has decided to hold, does not release.